Thank you so very much. All esteemed members, may I say how honoured I am to be invited to participate in the second Suicide Prevention Forum organised by the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea. I bring you directly greetings from Australia. We share in so many ways between our two countries our learnings and our understandings. And I count it a real privilege to be able to share with you this afternoon some of what we have learned in Australia. I come to you with greetings, as I say, from all of our colleagues in Australia in my role as the National Suicide Prevention Advisor to our Prime Minister, Mr. Scott Morrison, and also in my role as Chief Executive Officer of the National Mental Health Commission, where I report through to our Federal Health Minister, Mr. Hunt. I bring their greetings also. So today, what I would like to cover in this brief address and what we will now do, I think, is to share our screen with you, some of the slides that I would like to talk to give you an overview of what we have been seeing in Australia. Thanks, Matt. So what I would like to cover today is to talk briefly about the role that I was invited to take up in just 12 to 18 months ago, to share with you what is happening when we look at suicide in Australia. And we have had our most recent data released just last week, so I can talk to you about what we are seeing with respect not only to what has happened in the current year during COVID, but also our official statistics, to share with you a really important and exciting new development for Australia about how we have improved our data and the lessons we are learning about how to respond to COVID-19. It was only in July last year that this role of National Suicide Prevention Advisor was created. It was done in recognition of the fact that if in Australia we were really serious, as we are, to try and reduce the number of Australians we lose to suicide each year, and to reduce the number who are in suicidal crisis and attempt, how important it is that responsibility for this is acknowledged from the First Minister in our country, our Prime Minister. And this is supported by the First Ministers of each of our states and territories in our federated model. So I was invited, in continuing my role with the Mental Health Commission and in understanding that there is such a joining together of issues from a mental health perspective and suicide prevention, I was invited to take up this role. It is a role which has an initial appointment of 18 months. And I am called upon in this role to consult broadly with my colleagues in Australia, to advise the government, to advise the Prime Minister on how we can better coordinate and deliver suicide prevention in Australia. And most importantly, how can we improve a whole of government approach? I'm supported by a national task force, an expert advisory group, and to make sure we touch all aspects of our Commonwealth government, we have a committee which reaches across at a very senior level into each of our different departments. I provided an initial advice in November 2019 and have most recently provided an interim advice. What we are finding in that advice is three interesting things that I think will shift us. Up until now in Australia, we have had our suicide prevention activities directed by and included in our health and mental health work. That is really important. But what it has meant is that we really have been doing what we now call suicide intervention. We have been looking to intervene when we know somebody is in crisis. What we are trying to do is shift our focus so that what we will be looking at is how can we prevent somebody from actually reaching that point of suicidal crisis. For that, we need to reach outside health. We need to go into the various parts of government that touch on issues such as employment, that touch on issues such as housing and financial security. We need to understand when people are in distress, and we need to find a way as a government to be able to respond to that. And part of the opportunity that we have had as a task force this year is, as we've gone through the challenges of COVID-19, we have had the opportunity to see and understand, hopefully a little bit better, how such a cataclysmic event has impacted people's mental health, how it has raised the risk of suicide, and informed us as to what we can do so that we don't lose more Australians to suicide. So what is happening in Australia? We have two ways we look at reporting the data in Australia. We have what we call our definitive data. That is issued each year by our Australian Bureau of Statistics when they look at what they call the leading causes of death. And there is always a 1 year at least lag between the year we report on and when it's released. So just last Friday, the 23rd of October, we were made available the information about people who we lost to suicide in 2019. I will talk in a little while soon about another form of data we have, which is not quite so definitive, but does help us keep what I call a watching brief on what's happening in real time. In 2019, we lost 3,318 Australians to death by suicide. That is 3,318 people too many. That has what we call an age standardised rate of 12.9 per 100,000. It means that we are losing, on average, 9 Australians per day. Now, for Australia, and I understand that each place in the world, including Korea, has different, if you like, profiles on those we lose to suicide. In Australia, we consistently are losing more men to suicide than women. So in our statistics for 2019, we lost 2,502 men and 816 women. This is, unfortunately, an increase in total deaths on 2018. One other thing that I would like to say is that, yes, we are losing more men than women, but a very disturbing statistic for us is that when we look at suicide attempts, those who are in suicidal crisis, we see many more women presenting. To look behind our 2019 figures, over half of our deaths by suicide, 55%, occurred in people who are aged 30 to 59. Suicide overall is the 13th cause of death for people if you look at all aspects of causing death in Australia. But those causes of death that rank 1 to 12 are predominantly amongst our older Australians. So although suicide is the 13th cause of death, it is by far by far the most significant impact for our younger age group. Our highest rates are for men in the age bracket of 45 to 49, but we also must remember our older men aged 85. When we look at that age group in those middle years, if we take the ages of 15 to 44, then suicide is the leading cause of death. And it happens to too many Australians who are young. We had 96 children. That was pretty standard with what we had in previous years, and young people under the age of 17 who died by suicide. But a heartbreaking statistic is that 19 young people, 19 children under the age of 14, we lost to suicide in 2019. We also see that suicides are higher in our regional and rural areas than they are in our capital cities. And a really disturbing statistic for us is that for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, our First Nation people, we have a much higher rate of suicide, and that also went up in 2019. This slide will just show you that the male figures are higher than the females. You'll see the word preliminary there. We call it preliminary because when these figures are released for 2019, we keep a watching brief over them for 3 years so that we might do some small adjustments just to make sure that each year we're going back and just making sure that the deaths that we have recorded respect and acknowledge those we have lost to suicide. This will show you a trend over our last 10 years. And you can see there that whilst we have gone up and down in terms of our age standardised rates, we haven't solved it yet. We're still going up. And that is a concern that we are so committed to, and is why the Australian Prime Minister has decided, what do we need to do to look at this in a new way? So looking again at some of those challenges and what is it that we need to understand better about people who are at risk of suicide. Our suicide rates remain higher for those who live in the poorer areas of Australia. Suicide risk is lower in Australia if you have a job. One of the statistics I was looking at is that for men in that age bracket of 25 to 54 who are not in the labour force, so for a number of reasons we're not working, those who are unemployed, those who through mental illness, chronic pain, or for some other reason can't be included in the labour force, for them, they are at 3.2 times higher risk of suicide than for those men who are employed. Then we look at our women. And our women, when we look at moving away from those we lose to suicide to those who are in suicidal crisis, who attempt suicide, and we start to look at rates of self-harm and people we need to admit into our hospitals for care, 64% of those people are women. And the highest rates were for our young women, 15 to 19. Another very disturbing statistic that I am aware of is that when we look at women who we have lost to suicide, the shift between 2018 and 2019 for our young women, our women in that age bracket of 20 to 24 and 25 to 29, we have between a 30 and 35% increase in 2019. So whilst the number of women we lose to suicide compared to our men is smaller. We are seeing disturbing concerns in increases. We are also understanding more in 2019 about those things which may be contributing to suicide risk. We understand that people with mental health challenges around mood disorders, anxiety, stress, those with a personal history of self-harm, those who have challenges around alcohol and other drugs, and those who are going through challenging life circumstances with family separation and divorce are all at higher risk of suicide. So in Australia, what we are trying to do, in addition to understanding how we can use our whole of government, is we're saying, let's make sure we collect the data and really try and understand it. So in September of this year, we launched a public website, and I invite you all to go onto this website. You can access it through the National Mental Health Commission. And what it is doing is bringing together in one place as much information as we have for people to understand what is happening with suicide in Australia. It is an interactive site where you can go in and you can actually see data in different geographical areas. We're also bringing in data that's not just about deaths, but is about attempts. It is about self-harm. We've reached all getting data from our police forces and our ambulance to just see how can we try and understand it better. So what is happening for the risk of suicide in COVID-19? The risk has increased. As we look across all that is happening in Australia, and I'm sure you are experiencing this in Korea as well, we are seeing that people are more vulnerable. We are seeing that we have increased risk amongst people who are suffering from the economic consequences of how we have had to manage COVID-19. We have had lockdowns. We have had our economy negatively impacted. We are seeing job losses. We are seeing businesses being forced to close. That is raising the risk. For our older Australians who are living in circumstances of increased loneliness, where family can't visit them. For our healthcare workers, those at the front line who are putting their lives at risk each day, working with people with COVID and caring for them. For those who are using alcohol and other substances to cope. And in Australia in particular, at the beginning of this year, we had some terrible bushfires. They had a very severe impact on Australians. Those communities are very vulnerable, and they now have a second challenge with COVID-19. So a primary focus for us has been, how can we try and make sure that although we have increased risk of suicide in 2020, as we try to combat COVID-19, how can we stop that becoming more Australians that we lose? So we have had the opportunity at the highest levels of government, and I applaud each of you for being here and having in Korea such a senior commitment to doing this, because I have certainly learned with my colleagues in Australia that this needs to be led by the most senior national governing people to make it work. And we have had opportunities with the task force to actually advise the government. Yes, these people are at risk. What are some of the initiatives we can do that can help them? So we have worked with our colleagues on what we have called the National Mental Health and Wellbeing Pandemic Response Plan. That has 10 key priority areas in it, one of which is suicide prevention. We have focused on 3 very key areas where we need to improve and act quickly. We need to make sure our data and our modelling is telling us where are the points of vulnerability. We need to assertively reach out to people. We need to go to where people are living, where they're working, where they're learning, and say, we are here. It is easy to reach us. We are here to support you. And we need to make sure that our services are connected to each other. So when somebody does reach out for help, then they know that they will go to the right place for help. Some of what Australia has done has been of necessity to increase our reach through our digital online services, through our e-mental health services. We have tried to ensure that even if people are in lockdown at home, that they have got somewhere they can go 24/7, where they can talk to somebody either anonymously or in a more one-to-one scenario where they can pick up the phone, use Zoom or some other forms of connecting, where they can try to find a language to talk about the risks and where they can be helped to find strategies as to how to cope. It has been critical to Australia's response to increased mental health issues and increased suicide risk, that the single most important thing has been to learn the importance that whilst we have physical distancing, we have maintained social connection. So we are seeing that there is increased need on our helplines. We are seeing increased psychological distress, family violence has increased, anxiety levels, self-harm has increased. I mentioned before we have a second way of trying to track it. We have what we call registers, suicide registers in Australia. Those suicide registers are where we record in real time what we regard as being probable deaths for suicide. They need to be verified through our coroner process. But we have a 95% accuracy rate. So through 2020, we have used those suicide registers every day, every week, to look to try to ensure that our numbers of Australians we're losing to suicide do not increase. So we will continue to monitor that. We will continue to work across Australia through our pandemic mental health and wellbeing response plan to make sure that we are using all parts of government to better understand our Australians who are at risk, not only those at risk of being lost to suicide, but those at risk of suicidal crisis and attempt. And we will work diligently to bring all those efforts together towards a zero target. And we say towards zero because we do not want to lose any Australian. Every Australian life is valuable. So esteemed members, thank you again for the opportunity to share with you some of these learnings from Australia. We have a lot more to learn, and I look forward to learning from yourselves and your understandings so that as we work at a global level, to combat COVID-19, the pandemic, and as we work at a global level to bring down the number of people we lose to suicide, I welcome the opportunity to learn from you, and I thank you again for the opportunity to share with you. Thank you.
네, 감사드립니다. 큰 박수.
Thank you once again. Please give a big round of applause. So we are communicating with Dr. Morgan real time. Thank you very much for your presentation. So Koreans had some questions. So I'd like to ask questions to Dr. Morgan. So you have a control tower in Australia to prevent suicide. And who is the suicide prevention control tower? Is it Prime Minister or related welfare minister or welfare ministry, health and welfare ministry officers? Or can you please share us the roles, please?
네. 질문은 호주의 자살 예방과 관련.
So the question goes to Dr. Morgan, who is playing as the control tower to prevent suicide? Is it Prime Minister or the Minister of Health and Welfare, and what are their roles? Can you answer the question?
Thank you very much for. So in Australia, sorry, I'm hearing feedback there. I'll try and answer it. I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo of my own voice. So we have a shared responsibility in Australia for suicide prevention. So as the National Suicide Prevention Advisor, I report directly to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister leads our national cabinet in ensuring that all Australian governments are committed to what we can do to combat suicide and to lower the rates. But we also have a very close connection with our mental health services, and our suicide prevention and intervention services are managed through our mental health services and our mental health portfolios. So in my role with the National Mental Health Commission, where we work across all of our mental health services, we have a very strong commitment also to those suicide prevention services. So we are working to have what we call a coordinated, joined-up approach, which is shared not just by our health ministers, but also by our Prime Minister.
네, 감사합니다. 두 번째 질문인데요. 이 한국의 경우.
Yes, the second question is that in the case of South Korea, to quickly respond to suicide prevention, starting from this year, the police agency. Yes, the second question is that in the case of South Korea, to quickly respond to suicide prevention, starting from this year, the police agency. Is announcing suicide data every 2 months. So in August, they announced data about the potential suicide cases, but that is not precise yet. And the question is that if you have that kind of data announced on a regular basis, what is that data and how accurate is it?
Thank you. Good question, because once again, hearing it, can you get the? So once again, so it's a very important question because data is really important and key to understanding what is happening in real time. So with our suicide registers, we are trying to do perhaps similar to what you are doing with more regular release of information. And we will do this on the website that I shared with you. And whilst that is not data which has been confirmed by our coroners, because it is data which is being provided from those with expertise in understanding death by suicide, we are finding that through those, and we call them our suicide registers, and we have them not everywhere in Australia, but we have them in about half of our states and territories. We are finding that that information allows us to understand where there has been a death or a probable death by suicide, and we can understand that within a couple of days. And that helps us to determine, is there anything happening of particular concern? Are we seeing any clusters? Are we seeing any increased risk? Are we seeing increased numbers of attempts? All of which have helped us to try to ensure that we are responding quickly and making sure that services are where they are needed. So I would certainly applaud the Korean approach of looking to release information and data as quickly as possible and as regularly as possible.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you, Professor. We've got another question. After the COVID-19, there is an increasing trend in the number of suicide cases among women, especially among women. So what about in Australia? What is the case in Australia?
Again for that question. We are seeing in Australia increased risk for women. The 2019 data that I've shared has indicated that we are still losing 3 times as many men as we do women to suicide. But that is when we look at deaths. When we look at attempts, then certainly in Australia, we see there is a significant number of our attempts of suicide and our self-harm is from our women. And we are really concerned. We're seeing that as an increasing trend. We also have looked at the impact of COVID-19 on the mental health and well-being of all Australians. And we are seeing there is particular impact for women. We're seeing that in terms of rates of psychological distress. We're seeing it in terms of stress, particularly in family environments. We're seeing that one of the economic consequences is women becoming unemployed and the financial stresses. So we certainly are monitoring that in Australia, and we are trying to ensure that we are having responses to both suicide deaths but also to suicide attempts that address the particular needs of women and men.